Natalee Holloway.
Natalee Holloway.
Natalee Holloway.
Natalee Holloway.
She never made it home. One night, one decision, one monster hiding behind a smile, and an 18-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her simply vanished into the dark Caribbean night, leaving behind nothing but questions, silence, and a mother who would spend the next 18 years refusing to let the world forget. No body was ever found. No charges were ever filed. And the man who took her life walked free, changed his story dozens of times, killed again, and laughed at a system that couldn't touch him. Until it did. Until the day he stood inside a courtroom in Alabama, looked a judge in the eye, and finally said what everyone already knew. He killed her. He described exactly how he did it. And the truth, when it finally came, was so brutal that the people inside that courtroom went silent. This is the story of Natalee Holloway, and it does not end the way he planned.
A judge says the prime suspect in the 2005 disappearance of Natalee Holloway
The longtime suspect in the 2005 disappearance of Alabama teen Natalee Holloway.
Yesterday marks 20 years since the disappearance of Natalee Holloway.
Her name was Natalee Ann Holloway. She was 18 years old, an honor student, a dancer, a volunteer, a daughter, and a friend. She had just graduated from Mountain Brook High School in Alabama with a full scholarship waiting for her at the University of Alabama, where she dreamed of studying pre-medicine. By every measure, she was exactly the kind of person the world needed more of: kind, driven, brilliant, and full of a joy that people around her described as impossible to ignore. In late May 2005, she joined 124 of her classmates on a 5-day senior graduation trip to the island of Aruba. It was supposed to be the celebration of a lifetime, the last great adventure before adulthood arrived and changed everything. Instead, it became the night that shattered her family, gripped an entire nation, and launched one of the most painful and infuriating criminal cases in American history. She never came home, and someone made sure of that. It was May 26, 2005, when Natalee Holloway stepped off the plane in Aruba and felt the warm Caribbean air hit her face for the very first time. She was surrounded by 124 of her closest classmates from Mountain Brook High School in Alabama, along with 7 adult chaperones who were there to make sure the trip stayed within reason. The group checked into the Holiday Inn Resort near the northern end of the island, dropped their bags, and immediately felt the weight of senior year lift off their shoulders. This was it. The last great exhale before real life came rushing in. For the first 4 days, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be: sun-soaked beach afternoons, laughter that echoed across the hotel corridors at night, and the kind of freedom that only exists in that narrow window between childhood and adulthood. Nobody was thinking about danger. Nobody had any reason to. Joran van der Sloot was 17 years old that week, and he had made it his business to be wherever the American tourists were. He was a Dutch national, the son of a lawyer named Paulus van der Sloot, and he had grown up on the island, attending the International School of Aruba. He was tall, confident, and carried himself with the kind of ease that made people feel comfortable around him immediately. His classmates described him as a person who was entirely different by day than he was at night, charming in the sunlight, calculating in the dark. That week, he had been circling the Mountain Brook group, chatting with students in the hotel casino, making himself known, inserting himself naturally into their world without anyone thinking twice. He was just a local kid who liked to hang out with the tourists. That was the story. That was always his story. On the night of May 29th, moving into the early hours of May 30th, the group made their way to Carlos and Charlie's, a loud, colorful bar and restaurant in downtown Oranjestad that had become their go-to spot on the island. The music was pounding, the drinks were flowing, and the energy inside was exactly what you would expect from over 100 teenagers celebrating the end of their school years. Natalee was there with her 3 closest friends, Liz Kane, Mally Tucker, and Claire Fearman, and by all accounts, she was having the time of her life. The legal drinking age in Aruba was 18, the same age Natalee had just turned, and the atmosphere inside Carlos and Charlie's that night was loose and electric and completely intoxicating in every sense of the word. Joran van der Sloot was also inside Carlos and Charlie's that night. He found Natalee, and the two of them spent time together talking, dancing, existing in that same crowded, noisy space as the night stretched on toward closing time. Her friends noticed them together, but thought nothing of it. He seemed fine. He seemed harmless. He was just a local boy who had caught Natalee's attention for the evening, and in the chaos of a packed nightclub on the last night of a graduation trip, nobody felt the need to intervene or ask questions. That was the moment, the ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable moment that would haunt everyone who was there for the rest of their lives. At around 1:30 in the morning, as Carlos and Charlie's began to empty out, Natalee Holloway was seen walking outside and climbing into a car. She was with Joran van der Sloot and two brothers named Deepak and 𝐂𝐇𝐏𝐿𝐄𝐄, who worked as security guards and lived nearby. Her friend 𝐂𝐇𝐀𝐏𝐏𝐄𝐑𝐒 watched from the sidewalk as the car pulled away with Natalee visible through the open window in the back seat. Her impression in that moment was simple and completely reasonable. Natalee had found a ride back to the hotel. It made sense. It looked safe. There was nothing in that moment that suggested anything other than a girl getting home after a long night. The car turned and disappeared into the Aruban dark, and Natalee Holloway was never seen alive again. The morning of May 30th, 2005 started like any other checkout day. Bags were being zipped, sunscreen was being tossed into trash cans, and over 100 Mountain Brook students were slowly pulling themselves out of bed after one final night on the island. The mood was a mixture of exhaustion and nostalgia, the bittersweet feeling of a trip ending that everyone knew they would spend years trying to remember exactly as it was. Chaperones moved through the hotel hallways, doing what chaperones do, counting heads, checking rooms, making sure nobody had left anything behind. The group had a flight to catch. The plan was simple. And then one of the chaperones knocked on a door and found a room that hadn't been slept in. Natalee Holloway's bed was perfectly made. Her passport was still on the desk. Her bags were still packed exactly where she had left them. She had never come back. At first, nobody panicked. The instinct in that first moment was to find a reasonable explanation, because reasonable explanations are always easier to accept than the alternative. Maybe she had crashed in a friend's room after a long night. Maybe she had fallen asleep somewhere else in the hotel and hadn't heard her alarm. Teenagers on vacation do unpredictable things. Everyone in that hallway knew that. Her friends were asked if they had seen her. Calls were made to her phone. Her name echoed through the corridors of the Holiday Inn as classmates knocked on doors and checked the lobby and scanned the pool area with growing unease. But with every passing minute and every unanswered call, the reasonable explanations began to collapse one by one until there was nothing left to hold on to except fear. What made everything worse, what turned unease into full-blown terror, was a single detail that nobody could explain away. Natalee's passport and all of her belongings were still in her room. She had not packed. She had not checked out. She had not made any kind of deliberate decision to leave. Whatever had happened to her had happened suddenly, completely, and without warning. The chaperones contacted Aruban authorities and filed a missing persons report. One chaperone stayed behind on the island to wait, just in case Natalee showed up. The rest of the group, more than 100 students who had spent the last 5 days with her, boarded their flight back to Alabama in stunned, disbelieving silence, staring out airplane windows and praying that somehow this was all going to make sense by the time they landed. Beth Holloway received the phone call while she was still in Alabama. One of the chaperones told her that Natalee had not shown up for the flight and could not be located anywhere on the island. Beth would later describe that moment as the call that every parent dreads, the one that splits your life into before and after, with no warning and no preparation. But what stood out about Beth's reaction was how immediate and absolute her certainty was. She told reporters years later that she knew instantly, from the very first second, that something violent had happened to her daughter. Natalee was responsible. Natalee was not the kind of girl who missed flights or disappeared without a word. There was no version of this story where everything was fine. Beth knew it in her bones, and she was already moving before she had even hung up the phone. Beth Holloway and her then-husband 𝐂𝐇𝐀𝐏𝐿𝐄𝐑𝐒 boarded a private plane to Aruba within hours of that phone call, accompanied by family, friends, and relatives who refused to let her face whatever was coming alone. By the time they landed on the island, Natalee had been missing for nearly a full day. Beth went straight to the Holiday Inn and began asking questions, talking to hotel staff. talking to Natalee's friends who had stayed behind, piecing together the events of the previous night with the focused, terrifying energy of a mother who had already accepted the worst and was now simply looking for the truth. It was from those first conversations that a name emerged: a local boy named Joran, who had been seen with Natalee at Carlos and Charlie's and had left with her in a car just before 1:30 in the morning. That name would define the next 18 years of Beth Holloway's life. Ten days after Natalee Holloway vanished, Aruban authorities made their first move. On June 9, 2005, Joran van der Sloot and the 𝐂𝐸𝐄𝐏𝐄𝐏 brothers Deepak and Satish were arrested and taken in for questioning. The island, which had never dealt with anything close to this magnitude, was now at the center of an international media storm. Investigators had a timeline, they had witnesses, and they had 3 young men who had been the last people seen with Natalee alive. What they did not have was a consistent story from any of them. From the very first interrogation session, the accounts began to shift. Van der Sloot and the 𝐂𝐸𝐄𝐏𝐄𝐏 brothers claimed they had dropped Natalee off safely at the Holiday Inn at around 2:00 in the morning. It was a clean, simple story, and it was completely contradicted by every piece of evidence investigators found at the hotel. Security footage from the Holiday Inn showed nothing. No Natalee walking through the lobby, no keycard swipe on her room, no front desk interaction, no security guard who remembered seeing a blonde American girl return that night. The hotel's own records made it impossible, not just unlikely, but factually impossible for the story Van der Sloot was telling to be true. And yet, he kept telling it. When investigators pushed back, the story began to change. In one version, they had taken Natalee to see sharks near the beach. In another, they had driven her to the California lighthouse at the northern tip of the island. In yet another version, Van der Sloot claimed he had been dropped off at home first, leaving the 𝐂𝐸𝐄𝐏𝐄𝐏 brothers to drive away alone with Natalee. Every new version contradicted the previous one, and none of them explained where Natalee actually was. What made Van der Sloot particularly dangerous as a suspect was how comfortable he appeared to be with the process of lying. He did not crack under pressure. He did not become emotional or erratic in ways that investigators could use. He was 17 years old, sitting across from trained law enforcement professionals, and he adjusted his story with the calm, practiced ease of someone who had been preparing for exactly this situation. The 𝐂𝐸𝐄𝐏𝐄𝐏 brothers, meanwhile, began to distance themselves from him, claiming they had simply gone along with his decisions that night and had played no central role in whatever had happened. Their stories contained inconsistencies too, but it was Van der Sloot who remained the undeniable center of gravity in the investigation. Every thread led back to him. Every unanswered question pointed in his direction. In July 2005, the 𝐂𝐸𝐄𝐏𝐄𝐏 brothers were released from custody. Aruban law had strict limits on how long suspects could be held without formal charges, and without enough concrete evidence to charge them, authorities had no choice but to let them go. Van der Sloot remained in custody longer, but on September 3, 2005, he too was released without charges, without an indictment, and without any answers for the Holloway family. The outrage that followed was immediate and explosive. Beth Holloway, who had been watching the investigation closely from the moment she arrived on the island, publicly accused Aruban authorities of incompetence and possible corruption. She was not alone. Commentators, legal experts, and ordinary people across America looked at what had just happened and asked the same question: how do you let the last person seen with a missing girl simply walk out the door? The answer, frustratingly, was the law. Under Aruba's legal framework, based on the Dutch system rather than American law, prosecutors needed a far higher standard of evidence before they could formally charge anyone. Eyewitness accounts placing Van der Sloot with Natalee were not enough. Changing stories were not enough. The absence of any credible alternative explanation was not enough. In August 2005, the 𝐂𝐸𝐄𝐏𝐄𝐏 brothers were rearrested after prosecutors said new evidence had emerged, and they were charged with suspicion of rape and murder. Then they were released again. In November 2007, all 3 were rearrested once more, this time on charges of voluntary manslaughter, after a friend secretly recorded Van der Sloot appearing to admit that Natalee had died. Then they were released again. It was a cycle of arrests and releases that played out over years. And each time it happened, the Holloway family was forced to relive the nightmare all over again. By 2007, Joran van der Sloot had settled into a life that should not have been possible for a man under the shadow of an international murder investigation. He was studying in the Netherlands, moving freely between countries, giving media interviews, and had even co-written a book about the Natalee Holloway case, a book in which he wrote, with breathtaking audacity, that he hoped every day that Natalee would be found. He was not hiding. He was not ashamed. He was performing. The world was watching a young man who had been questioned, arrested, released, and arrested again walk through life as though none of it had touched him. And the most disturbing part was not the freedom itself, it was how completely at ease he appeared to be inside it, as if he had always known that the system would never be able to hold him. Then came December 2007, and the moment that seemed, finally, like a turning point. A Dutch journalist named Peter de Vries had spent years investigating the Holloway case, and he had obtained something extraordinary, a secret recording made by a friend of van der Sloot's, in which van der Sloot appeared to describe, in his own words, what had happened to Natalee. On the recording, he told his friend that Natalee had died and that he had arranged for her body to be disposed of. The footage was aired on Dutch television and triggered an immediate international response. For millions of people who had followed the case for 2 years, this felt like the confession the Holloway family had been waiting for. Investigators reopened their work. Authorities in Aruba made moves. And van der Sloot was arrested for the 3rd time. What happened next was a masterclass in manipulation that still defies belief. When confronted directly with the recording, van der Sloot did not break down. He did not confess. He looked investigators in the eye and told them that everything on the tape was a lie that he had been showing off for his friend, making up a dramatic story to sound important, and that none of it was true. He insisted the recording had been taken out of context and that he had fabricated the entire account. And incredibly, devastatingly, it worked. The Aruban legal system required more than a recording of uncertain context to sustain charges. In December 2007, prosecutors announced they were dropping all remaining cases against van der Sloot and the 𝐂𝐀𝐏𝐄 brothers due to insufficient evidence. He walked free. Again, by 2010, Natalee's case had been out of the headlines for several years. But Beth Holloway had never stopped. She was still searching, still pushing, still refusing to accept that a mother who knew what had happened to her daughter would never get answers. It was in this context that van der Sloot made the decision that would ultimately end his freedom. He reached out to Beth through an intermediary and offered to sell her the location of Natalee's remains for $250,000. He asked for $25,000 up front. Beth agreed. But what van der Sloot did not know was that the FBI was already involved, monitoring every move, recording every communication, building a case around the extortion attempt in real time. He took the money, provided a false location, and immediately fled to Peru, believing, as he always had, that he had outsmarted everyone. What van der Sloot could not have anticipated was that Peru would become the place where his pattern finally ran out of room. On May 30th, 2010, exactly 5 years to the day after Natalee Holloway disappeared, he met a 21-year-old Peruvian woman named Stephanie Flores at a casino in Lima. Within hours, Stephanie was dead in his hotel room, beaten and strangled with brutal, savage violence. Security cameras captured him leaving the room alone. DNA evidence left no doubt. The man who had spent 5 years walking free while the world searched for answers about one young woman had now murdered a second one, and this time there were no legal loopholes, no insufficient evidence, and no system willing to let him go. The chase across South America lasted only days before Chilean authorities arrested him at a border crossing. Joran van der Sloot was finally in handcuffs that would not open again. In January 2012, a Peruvian court did what Aruba had never been able to do it, convicted Joran van der Sloot of murder and sentenced him to 28 years in prison. The court found that he had killed Stephanie Flores with ferocity and extreme cruelty, beating and strangling a 21-year-old woman in a Lima hotel room with the same cold brutality he had used on a beach in Aruba 7 years earlier. For the Holloway family, the conviction was a complicated moment. There was relief that he was finally behind bars. There was grief that the justice being served was for a different victim in a different country. And there was the knowledge that the extortion charges still pending in the United States, the charges that connected him directly to Natalee, were sitting in a federal courthouse in Birmingham. waiting for a day that might never come. He was in Peru. He would stay in Peru. And the clock kept moving. For years, the extradition question was the center of everything. Peru had initially agreed that Vander Sloot would be sent to the United States only after completing his full 28-year sentence, which meant 2038. Beth Holloway had spent nearly a decade fighting that timeline, working with American prosecutors, lobbying Peruvian officials, and making the case publicly and privately that the witnesses in the extortion case were aging. That time was the enemy of justice, and that her family deserved to see this man face an American court before they died waiting. In May 2023, Peru's government changed course. Under a 2001 treaty between the two countries, they agreed to temporarily transfer Vander Sloot to the United States to face the extortion and wire fraud charges, after which he would be returned to Peru to complete his sentence. Beth Holloway called it a moment she had been fighting for since 2010. On June 8, 2023, Joran Vander Sloot was transferred from 𝐂𝐇𝐏𝐄𝐑𝐒 prison, a remote maximum security facility sitting at over 12,000 feet in the Peruvian Andes, and placed on a plane to the United States. FBI agents accompanied him on the flight. When he landed in Birmingham, Alabama, he was taken into federal custody and formally charged with extortion and wire fraud. For the first time in 18 years, the man who had taken Natalee Holloway's life was standing on American soil, facing an American judge, inside the city where Natalee had grown up, graduated, and dreamed about her future. Beth Holloway stood outside the courthouse and told reporters that they were finally getting justice for Natalee. The word finally carried the weight of nearly 2 decades of silence, grief, and relentless, exhausting, unbreakable determination. On October 18, 2023, Joran Vander Sloot appeared before U.S. District Judge Anna Manasco in Birmingham and entered a guilty plea on the extortion and wire fraud charges. As part of the plea agreement, he provided a full recorded confession delivered in an interview with his own attorney, describing in graphic, devastating detail exactly what he had done to Natalee Holloway on the beach in Aruba 18 years earlier. He said she had rejected his sexual advances. He said she fought back. He said he grabbed a Cinderblock and crushed her head with it. He described watching her face collapse in the darkness. He said he dragged her body into the ocean and walked home. Judge Manasco sentenced him to 20 years for the extortion charges and told him directly in that courtroom that he had brutally murdered 2 young women who had dared to say no to him. There was no applause. There were no celebrations. There was just the sound of a truth that had taken far too long to arrive. Beth Holloway stood outside that Birmingham courthouse afterward and said the words she had been waiting 18 years to say. She told the world that Joran Vander Sloot was no longer the suspect in her daughter's murder. He was the killer. She said she was satisfied knowing that he had acted alone, that Natalee had fought back, and that the ocean had taken her daughter in a place far from home. The confession could not bring Natalee back. It could not return the 18 years that had been stolen from a family who had done nothing wrong except love a girl who deserved to come home. But it answered the question that had haunted a nation since a warm Caribbean morning in May 2005, and it proved that a mother, with enough love, enough fury, and enough refusal to accept silence could eventually force the truth out of even the darkest places. Natalee Holloway was 18 years old. She had a scholarship, a dream, and a future that should have been extraordinary. She deserved to come home. For 18 years, her mother Beth refused to let the world forget her name, and because of that refusal, the truth finally came out. Joran Vander Sloot confessed. The world heard it, and Natalee, wherever she is, finally got the justice she deserved. This case involved extensive research and took considerable time to cover every angle properly. If you want to read the complete investigation in full detail, we have added all resource links in the description. You can go through everything from there. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Hidden Truth. Every case we cover is a real person, a real family, and a real fight for answers. Hit the bell so you never miss a video. We will keep telling these stories until every name is heard.